Good morning, everyone. It's always my colleagues that take their seats the last. I'm Stacy Murchison, Chief Marketing Officer at Chevy Chase Trust, and on behalf of my colleagues, welcome. This is the third in a biannual series of events focused on issues important to women, and by extension, men. Since most men I know have a mother, or a sister, or a wife, or a daughter, today's topic is women in progress, not for women only. Since we all know and data shows that when women and girls have access to opportunities to participate and progress, economies grow and nations prosper. We are delighted to have two distinguished women with us today who are experts in their respective fields and who are leaning in to make a difference and make the world a better place. Our first session will feature Ambassador Melanne Verveer, a woman of many talents and achievements. Melanne will describe the current state of women and girls on the heels of the January 21st women-led marches that took place in over 600 locations and across 7 continents. She will also focus on stories from her recent book about remarkable women in global leadership and public service who are utilizing their growing economic power to build businesses that give back and who are leveraging their resources to empower other women. Very key. After her remarks, I will interview Melanne for a few minutes, and then we'll open it up to your questions. We'll take a short break for lunch to be served, and then my colleague, Amy Raskin, our Chief Investment Officer, will introduce Dr. Claudine Isaacs. Dr. Isaacs is the co-director of the breast cancer program at the Lombardi Comprehensive Cancer Institute. She will give us an update on the very latest news on breast cancer research, genetic testing, and cancer prevention strategies. After her remarks and an interview with Amy, we again will open it up to your questions. I promise that the entire program will be concluded by 1:30. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Melanne Verveer. Currently, Melanne is the executive director of Georgetown University's Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. She served as the first ever ambassador at large for global women's issues at the U.S. Department of State, having been nominated by President Obama in 2009. Melanne coordinated foreign policy issues and activities related to the political, economic, and social advancement of women, traveling to nearly 60 countries. Melanne is also the co-founder, chair, and co-CEO of Vital Voices Global Partnership, an international NGO that invests in emerging women leaders, and Seneca Women, a global leadership community. During the Clinton administration, she served as an assistant to the president and chief of staff to the First Lady. Melanne has a BS and an MS from Georgetown University, has received numerous honorary awards, including the U.S. Secretary of State's Award for Distinguished Services. Her book, Fast Forward: How Women Can Achieve Power and Purpose, will be the subject of our conversation today, and each of you will receive a copy as you leave. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Melanne Verveer.
Well, thank you, Stacy, and good morning to each and every one of you. I want to thank Chevy Chase Trust for bringing us all together. We, as you heard, will engage in a conversation, Stacy and me, and then hopefully with many of you. But before, I just want to say a few words at the outset. Why women? Why now? I'm going to make a bold statement despite these times. I believe we find ourselves on the cusp of a global power shift because there is a growing mountain of evidence and data from the public sector and the private sectors alike, from the World Bank to the World Economic Forum, that demonstrate that women at this moment are among the most powerful demographics the world has ever seen. We are poised to rival China and India as an economic force alone. 1 billion women are set to enter the world economy over the next decade. Let me give you just one data point. McKinsey & Company recently released the Global Parity Report, and its conclusion was that if we close the gender gap, that could drive between $12 trillion and $28 trillion in GDP growth around the world by 2025. Women are an underutilized economic opportunity of unprecedented proportions. And the condition of the human race would be lifted up everywhere if we were to succeed. But obstacles stand in our way. Each of us knows that. They range from discrimination to widespread violence against women, which is truly a global scourge. From design flaws in the workplace that keep us from often doing the kind of caregiving that we would like in the way we would like, to the basic denial of women's rights, human rights in so many places. But the potential is enormous. Already women own or lead more than a quarter of the private businesses around the world. In the United States, if women entrepreneurs were a country, the GDP would rank 5th, close to the powerhouse of Germany. That's what we bring in terms of an economic force. It's not just about how much women earn, however, although it is the purchasing power of women in the trillions of dollars that have garnered the attention of many who understand what that purchasing power represents. But it's how we spend it. Wealth in the hands of women has a multiplier effect. Women tend to reinvest their earnings in their families and in their communities. It raises GDP in many places in the world, it lowers illiteracy, and it raises the standard of living for everyone. And I like so much what Stacy said about the men in our audience, because women's progress is everybody's progress. When women progress, society progresses. And I would like for these not to be considered women's issues, but issues that affect all of us, men and women alike. So we get a double dividend, so to speak, out of the way women spend their income. And if you take all of this together, investing in women and girls, it's the right thing to do. It is fundamentally the right thing to do, something none of us would quibble with. But today, because of the data, because of all of the things we're learning about these investments, for decision makers, it is the smart and strategic thing to do. And leaders of countries and companies are beginning to recognize the role that women must play and can play. And the book, which I hope you will enjoy, goes into countless examples and stories of the kinds of roles women are playing, and men, in recognizing this, what women's economic power in particular and social power represents in so many different ways. Moreover, in addition to the evidence-based case, there are an historic and rising number of women in leadership positions. You all represent that, and this is true certainly in our country and the world over increasingly. And technology is creating connectivity as never before. So how are women capitalizing on this confluence of factors? The data, the fact that we are in positions of leadership in so many different ways, not just at the top, but significant ways beyond, as well as the ability to connect with each other with greater facility than ever before. I see women increasingly using their power for purpose and connecting with each other to exponentially grow the kind of progress we would all like to see. And so that's why the book is called Fast Forward. To fast forward us to a better world requires all of us recognizing the power we have to make a difference. One in which we can advance women and girls globally. Wherever we sit, we don't have to quit our day jobs. We can tap that ability in ways that we grow to recognize and then act on. This is a success that's certainly based on professionalism, but also on meaning, impact, and fulfillment in our lives. How each of us can find and recognize our purpose, tap the power, and truly make a difference. You know, I often think of the struggle women have been engaged in for long decades, not just here in our country, but the world over. But I often think about us and that first Women's Equal Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. And I remember some years ago reading a book by a young woman named Charlotte Woodard. She knew that her life had to change. She wanted her life to change. She was living in upstate New York at a time when women did not have the right to vote. The meager wages that they earned, they could not keep. She was a glove maker. Education was not as readily available as one would have liked. If one found herself in a horrific marriage, there was no divorce. And it was a time that cried out for change. And she heard about a convention that was going to take place in Seneca Falls, and she decided that she would go. But she wrote in her memoirs that she was terrified that she'd be all alone on this road, naively going in hopes that her life could change. And she said as she set out, it was dark, but as the sun came up, she saw stagecoaches and people on foot coming in all directions on this journey for equal rights. And the women were accompanied by the good men. A third of the participants in the Women's Rights Convention were men, and Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, was one of them. And he said that he felt ennobled by the cause, because when he was involved in the abolition movement, as he continued to be, it was about himself and his people. And he said, I felt ennobled, struggling as the women went forward to find a better day. And that journey continues. 150 plus years later, it continues in this country in a different way. We are in a far better place than those women were back then. But it is interesting that Charlotte Woodard was the only one of all the women who went to Seneca Falls who was alive to see women get the right to vote. We can grow that progress because we're all on that journey still, here and around the world at different places. And I believe we are at a moment, if we can come together, a propitious moment in history when forces are converging and creating the potential for transformative change, a one big giant leap in a way where we can move forward and we can move faster and we can really make a difference if we seize it. And I believe our moment is now. Thank you.
We are so excited to have you, and why don't we just dive right in?
Sure.
So in the 2016 election, you all remember that?
Seemed like so long ago.
We saw the total number of women in both chambers remain the same. We saw the number of female governors go from 6 to 5. We have heard from Emily's list that they have received unprecedented numbers of inquiries from women seeking advice who are interested in running for office. Could it be that 2018 will be another year of the woman? And what are the remaining barriers that women have to overcome to get involved in U.S. politics?
Well, it's not just true of the United States, but it is true worldwide that women's progress, however it's measured, whether on economics or access to education, health, etc., that of all the measurements that can be taken of the progress that women are making, political participation is at the bottom. We are having the toughest time the world over, but a very tough time accessing political power. And as you've said, we're not particularly standout here in the United States. We have about 19% women in our Congress. Many other countries are significantly ahead of us, many because they adopted quotas and put them in place to give women an equal opportunity, not a free ride, but an opportunity to engage, because in many places they would never get the chance. And so today you have a number of countries who have that critical mass, 30% women in their legislatures. And what we also know from the studies that have been done, that when women can access political power, they invest in ways that are often different from their male counterparts. Now, in this country, if you're a Republican, if you're a Democrat, you're going to pretty much vote with your party, whatever your party affiliation. But on so many issues, even in our country, with the small number of women we've historically had in the Congress, it has been the women coming together across the aisle that has proven to have incredible impact, and then bringing in their male colleagues. Title IX, think of all of the medals that came out of the recent Olympics that U.S. women brought home. That would not have happened but for what Title IX made possible in giving women students equal access in public institutions for the resources that sports can provide. A violence against women law has made such a difference in criminalizing what this nefarious behavior represents. Various health initiatives, credit initiatives, and it's been women coming together across the aisle. One of the last times when there was a threat to close the Congress, we had significant numbers of women at the time, proportionately speaking, who were in positions of responsibility on their committees, and they came together and said, we can't let this happen. There's a study about women at the lowest level of politics in India, the panchayat level, village level. And I think it was MIT that did this study. And they looked at women, many of them not well educated, but because of a quota that was instituted in India years ago to enable women's participation in local governance, large numbers of women came into these positions. Today, they are running at an enormously higher rate, far beyond those quota seats for office, and this phenomena has been called the silent revolution in India's democracy. They are governing differently. The public investments are going into education, going into sanitation, going into safe drinking water, going into the kinds of things that the community needs. So we see correlations between women's political engagement and the impacts for society as a result of that. But there's still so few women proportionately in these spaces. Get back to our recent election. One of the phenomena, and it's not at this point being measured in any way except by organizations that are really feeling it, is this push an interest of younger women to engage in politics. There are groups like in Maryland, there's Emerge Maryland, there's Running Start to give younger women a running start at a future political career. But my own phone is ringing in ways that it hadn't earlier. How do you run for office? Who provides training programs? It's a very difficult pursuit. And the money alone that would have to be raised, the communication skills, how you deal in this arena of great contention in many ways, is something that women have recoiled from. And so many parts of the world, women have said to me, that's dirty business. I don't want any part of it. And yet that's where the power is. And if you can't access the power, you can't really access and make possible the kind of change many people want to see.
Let's talk about the World Economic Forum publishes a gender gap each year, and the gender gap is a measure of how we're doing, men and women, on 4 different issues, really access to healthcare, education, economic participation, and political empowerment. So how are we doing in closing that gap?
Well, you know, this is a really interesting question. I have found it fascinating that the World Economic Forum, which is sort of the barons of industry and top government leaders, mostly male in that very big, powerful structure, do an annual gender gap report. And as Stacy said in this report, they look at 4 metrics: economic participation, access to health care, access to education, and political empowerment. Now, in those 4 areas, they've been measuring over a decade now, and nobody can accuse the World Economic Forum of being a women's organization. Why do they do this? They do this because in the countries where the gap between men and women is closer to being closed, equal opportunity, and nowhere is it closed on those 4 metrics, completely closed. But where it is, those countries are far more prosperous and far more economically competitive. So there's reason to their doing this, given what they represent. And over the last decade that they've been doing it, they have seen the gap between education and health really closing rather significantly in many, many, many countries. Economics is still hovering in the middle someplace in terms of economic participation, and political participation is at the bottom. Really, really tough in terms of women's political empowerment. The United States has been slipping on this measurement. We are now 45th out of, I think, 180 countries. And remember, it's on only 4 metrics, significant metrics. But the reason for the slippage, the most significant reason, is that the numbers of women in the workforce, instead of going up, is going down. And one of the things that economists and others are asking is, what is that due to? Is it due to the lack of care for women with children? Is it due to other kinds of impediments that they confront? But we are going we have for years have been just advancing dramatically in terms of our workforce numbers, but there has been a halt and a going back. And another area is the political participation, that our numbers comparatively are lower than they should be. So it's mixed. Education, health, much, much, much better, but some troubling signs that have bumped us down on this chart.
Well, Ann, a few minutes ago you alluded to more women in the C-suite. We know that there are more women serving on corporate boards, which is a topic near and dear to my heart. 2020 Women on Boards has even said recently that their goal of reaching 20% women serving on the boards of publicly traded companies by the year 2020 is close to being reached. In fact, they think we'll reach 20% by 2018. But it's still just 20%, Milan. So how do we move beyond 20%? And should we be looking at quotas?
Well, the issue of board quotas is often even more controversial than political quotas. And Norway led the way on quotas. The Scandinavian countries are ahead on everything. When it comes to gender issues, closing gender gaps, parity, they're really quite at the top. And Norway instituted these quotas. We're still learning after several years now what difference that made. And I think certainly there are more women engaged, and then the impacts is what's being looked at. There are studies, a number of studies. Catalyst, I think, has some of the biggest studies on what difference it makes to have women on boards of directors, because it's not just a numbers game. There's an impacts game as well. I shouldn't say game, but it has impacts. And what the studies show is that when women are on boards at a critical mass over a period of time, a critical mass is 3, not 2, not 1, that the profits on the equities of the companies goes up. And I think if you think about it in terms of what diversity represents, that diversity is really a positive. And when you bring women with their talents, with their perspectives, just as we saw in Congress and certain legislation, with their experiences to bear, along with the obviously with the men who are on the boards, you do bring added advantages. It's why companies are seeing today, certainly with women's purchasing power, that if women aren't in their design operations, if they're not at every level of their operations, that is going to be something that doesn't turn out for the better in terms of the bottom line. But where you're really tapping the talents of women, as you would on boards or in higher management, which is still a very tough place for women, although there have been growing numbers of success stories, it's just not happening fast enough. But what we are learning today is the impacts, which hopefully would be more persuasive to the decision makers, not just the right thing to do, but the smart thing, the strategic thing to do, would begin to change that dynamic. And you're right, in England, they don't have quotas for boards, as some countries have instituted. Germany has just instituted one, I think, for public boards. But in England, they've got something called the 30% Club, where through leverage and catalytic actions and pressure, political arm twisting, they are trying to move that number up, and they may well succeed at reaching 30% in the very near term.
Great. Let's shift a little bit towards more of your book. You talk about combining power with purpose. This book has just an amazing array of stories about women who are making a difference in the companies that they are working in. Could you share with us maybe a story about Coca-Cola or Walmart, companies that are really experiencing progress in this area?
Well, I'll just tell you a couple so that you can do it on your own time yourself with the book, hopefully. But Coca-Cola, to me, is very interesting. Their CEO, Muhtar Kent, he's just recently they've announced he'll be just moving into the chair position, and someone else will be coming in as CEO. He really understands the power of women as a political force. And he was encouraging to the women in the company, of whom there are large numbers, and he wanted to set up a women's leadership council. And so some of the women at various, in various parts of the company came together. He empowered them to really think smartly about an agenda that would move the company forward in terms of opportunities for women. Recognizing those opportunities for women were also good for the company. And when they told me, the women told me that when they gave him their first attempt at a strategy, he looked at it and told them it didn't go far enough. And they have made incredible progress. I was there several months ago, and the younger women were saying at the time that they are working with the council to create a new leave policy that would be more advantageous, which in fact they have done. But they've also created incredible initiatives recognizing how important it is for women in economies. This is a company that does business all over the world, for women to be successful, economically successful, certainly. And they created a program called 5 by 20 to create 5 million new female entrepreneurs, or to grow the capacity of entrepreneurs by the year 2020, 5 million. And they're doing that by using their value chain. So think of their value chain from farming, because they have a lot of fruit juices, the agriculture productivity and what goes into that is important to the quality of the juice. So from the level of farming to recycling at the other end of the spectrum, knowing that in between is marketing, distributions, all aspects of the company, their value chain. They have been engaging women within the company and outside in growing their entrepreneurial possibilities. And it's striking to see how much more productive and profitable the women farmers have become. Out of recycling operations, they've been making extraordinary jewelry and selling it successfully, as well as cleaning up neighborhoods. And in between, you see these very small businesses in some places that had small amounts of product line that are now growing into really small businesses that the women own. So it's just one example. There have been multiple examples today of companies that are growing in this space of recognizing women's power as an economic force and raising women and their families up in the process and benefiting with their bottom line. It's a win-win, and I think that's one of the big changes today, is the private sector in particular understanding why this is a win-win.
And a different story, but one that I found so fascinating, and it was a shorter story, was the one about Avon. I mean, I didn't know much about Avon when I started reading your book, and discovered that they were doing more than just delivering cosmetics around the world. So
Avon's such an interesting company because they started before women had the right to vote in the United States. And their founder, who was selling books, I think, realized that as a teaser, as he was selling these books, he would also provide some perfume. And he saw how women were really attracted to it, and it became women selling to women. And over time, they started with, I think, a staff of 4, and today they're a $9 billion business with some 6 million women all over the world engaged in direct selling. And in the process, they understood that when a woman goes to the home of another woman, a group gets together, it's also an opportunity to help her in ways beyond the money that she is able to earn. And it's also interesting because the credit, you're basically getting these products at credit. The company is giving you them to sell, and then it works out so much to the company and so much to you. So that credit line, when women can't access credit, is also interesting. Credit is one of the hard things to access for women in small business. But this social aspect is fascinating because even their operations on the Amazon, where women are going down the Amazon and selling the products, and 4 lipsticks are sold every second, I think, they're also providing information. So on the Amazon, it's about breast cancer and what you need to know about this disease. In other places, it's been about violence against women. In Russia, for example, where it's a horrific problem, and they've just in their Duma, they just voted to lessen the punishment for this crime when it's perpetrated within the family. So sort of sending a signal that abuse within the family is not such a bad problem. But what Avon has been doing is providing information in these quiet ways, door to door, house to house, far flung across the country, on how women can take care of themselves.
It's amazing.
So it's a very interesting byproduct of a social commitment beyond an economic commitment.
Yeah, terrific. I'm going to ask one more question and then open it up to your questions. But my last question really is a request. In the book, there is a fantastic toolkit, and I know that some of the folks in the audience may want to get involved with some issues regarding gender inequality after today's program. So maybe you could talk about the toolkit in the book and how people can get involved.
Well, what we did, my co-author and I, was not just tell the story about what's happening on the macro level and all of these individual narratives of women in all different places in their work. Some are at the top, some are just really entry level, and the difference that they made in their company. If I can, really quickly, the company Liz Claiborne was involved very significantly in this issue of violence against women. They had done amazing work as a company that benefited the larger issue area. And the company was not doing well. The new CEO came in. He told me this story, and he said that my job was to cut, to create as many savings as possible, and to really begin to try to get them on a different trajectory. When a young woman in the company somehow mustered her courage, had the confidence, she believed in what they were doing, and she asked for a meeting with the CEO. And she came in and she talked to him about this program, which she said to me, I was prepared to cut it. I mean, it was a significant expenditure on the part of the company. And she came in, she educated me, she told me what we were doing in a leadership way, and that commitment stayed because of someone at a level you would not anticipate having this kind of conversation with the CEO. But I think there are impediments that we confront, whether it's lack of confidence, the fear of failure. Every major woman we talked to writing this book raised this issue on her own. It is something that I think women grapple with in their lives and taking that next step. But hopefully, the combination of the inspiring stories and this toolkit to enable you to find those steps that you can take as an individual in understanding it's not to quit your day job, where you work, what you do in your community, what you're interested in, and how to take that position that you have, that power that you have, focus on something you believe needs to get done with kindred spirits, connecting with others. It's amazing what can happen. In fact, it's the only way anything happens if we're honest with each other. So I think particularly in times when there is an eagerness to really try to make things better, and certainly advancing progress for women and girls has enormous dividends. We can all be in that space, and that's what we try to set out is ways to engage first with ourselves and then with others in how to move forward.
Terrific, terrific. So I have two colleagues, Mark Wishkoff and Craig Pernick, who have microphones, and if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. There's one right here. Okay.
Hi, my name is Amy Veith, and thank you so much for your comments. I was listening to your statements about how women in America are really struggling on different levels economically. We're not present in politics as much as we'd like to be on boards. And then you also mentioned that the Scandinavian countries are doing extremely well. I think most of us know that, but the Scandinavian countries is where you find the greatest child support programs, the wonderful options to stay home for a year. Your husband stays home for a year. Everybody supports you. I'd like you to comment on that connection and why the Americans haven't maybe figured this part out.
Well, I think that's a great question, and in a way, it really supports why we need women to be more engaged in the public sector, because in the end, a lot of it has to do with decisions in government. We are the only industrial country in the world that does not have maternal leave policies, parental leave, paid parental leave. The only industrial country in the world, the United States of America. The child care support that we provide is really minimal. There's a small tax write-off for middle-income folks, and then some support for very low-income people. But it's very minimal. And government policies do make a difference. It's why in some countries, Japan, for example, President Abe has instituted womenomics as part of his Abenomics, larger economic reform policy, because they increasingly understand unless they get more women into the workforce, they cannot grow the GDP of that country, and the effects of all of that will not be good. So they're looking at all of the issues that you raised today. Every time I've heard him speak, it's about how many more child care spots we are making possible, because we don't want any kind of a waiting list. In Scandinavia, they've also really focused on fathers and how child rearing should be, both parents understanding the benefits of the bonding as well as the responsibilities. And at first, it was either in Norway or Sweden, the men weren't taking the leave that was afforded them. I think the understanding was that probably because they felt there might be some negative pushback in terms of their careers. And then they said, no, you're going to lose this opportunity unless the men take it as well. And the bottom line from all of that over the last several years now has been young fathers basically saying, why was I deprived of this? Understanding what that bonding represents, far better, more productive in the workplace, and really understanding that men and women become co-beneficiaries together in these situations. So I think we have to do a lot better. I have never understood, and I've worked in the public policy arena for many years, why there isn't the traction that I think we should have on these issues in the United States, and to get our policymakers once and for all to really address them more seriously. They are not women's issues, if that's their inhibition. It's really about the kind of economy we want to have, the kind of society we want to have, to really lift all of our people up. So thank you for that question. It's right here.
Just to follow up on that, it seems to me that wages for childcare workers and teachers in not honoring the profession of teaching. In Scandinavia, teachers are one of the most revered professions, and in our country it's an afterthought. I have a child who says he has a vocation to teach, but is afraid he can't afford to choose that as a vocation. I wondered what you could comment about what we can do about that.
This is a very well-informed audience. Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I was horrified the time we were doing the first ever child care conference in the White House, and I learned in the process that we pay far more to the people who park our cars than we do to the people who take care of our children. Now, obviously, there are differences depending where and how, but it goes to the heart of our values. There's nothing more important than education and enabling children to be all that they can be. But yet you're right, the teaching profession, for whatever reason.
And education schools aren't very well regarded, and
as feeders for education. Which is one of the reasons that a program like Teach for America came into play, where you would take graduates of non-education institutions and give them a track to going into some of our public schools. But this is where I think we have to come together. I think we need to understand we are all in positions where we can make a difference. And to create this force, national force, to really do something about the two issues that you raised, which I think are right on the mark.
But you have to be willing to pay, right?
Well, you have to be willing to pay either in terms of government or in terms of other ways that the trade-offs are made. But we also have to understand what's at stake. And I think so often in the heat of our debate, we hear this, and we don't even understand what's at stake when somebody's trying to persuade us to do this or this. And it's informing that discussion in ways that we don't lower property taxes and impede the financial base for the public schools, for example. But there are stakes in all of this, but we're less and less informed, in my view, despite the massive information attack in some ways we're all under every day, more information than ever with less understanding than ever. So I think we've got to do something to raise up that level of understanding so we make the right choices and understand why it's important to make them.
Maybe I don't read it like Would you say something about diversity, Milan? About our increasingly diverse community? How are women doing? How are diverse women doing? What are they doing? How much are they affecting us in the power struggle?
Well, I think diversity is an extraordinary advantage. You know, I remember once being told that America's diversity is our strength if we can manage it. And I really believe that. As someone who has traveled the world, when I'm asked where I come from and it's America, it's usually the first comment is, oh, everyone in your country came from someplace else. And it's this marvel that we've been able so far to knit together everything that represents. And I think it is today under increasing attack. But when we understand, for example, the diversity that women bring to the workplace, to entrepreneurship, to decision making, it is a strength of the final product that is being intended. One of the things that I've seen happen more and more with millennials is that, and a number of CEOs of companies have told me this, that as the millennials are coming, and these are among our best and brightest coming into the companies, they're asking many questions. One has to do with the purpose of your company. We know you make widgets, but what's your real purpose? But inevitably the question comes down to, what's your policy for diversity and inclusion? Because it's not enough to put us all together, but it's how do we feel we belong? And that we're respected and that we can produce our utmost. I was at a company in Silicon Valley not too long ago, and a number of the women were saying, we're here, but we don't feel like we belong. And they're there because their talents are recognized and they're having huge impacts. They love their work, but something doesn't feel right, and it's that sense of not feeling totally included. So I think we have to work certainly at the diversity, but we have to work at the inclusion as well, but we have to fundamentally understand that this is a strength, and it's not a zero-sum game, that if she gets the job, I lose. We all benefit as we can move forward. And we have to do something to enable everybody to be in that situation.
Are our corporate leaders pushing on women, Somalis, Hispanic, Black,
No, I see it more and
Do you
more.
see that?
You see it in companies. The problem in a lot of companies today is you're having this enormous infusion of women into the companies. Look at the numbers of women in graduate school today in the United States. But they're there, they get so far, and then the top levels become where they face that huge obstacle and aren't promoted. So a lot of work is going into how do we change that dynamic? What can women do to help themselves, and what can companies, what can the male leadership do to really make that work in a way that it's currently working?
Good morning. Thank you so much for your remarks. My name is Alejandra Segura, and I would like to ask for your insights on women in the developing world. That is where the majority of women live. And as you well know, they are, most of them, at poverty level or under it. And for example, I am from Argentina, and in Latin America, only 10% of private funds go to education. So if we're talking about advancement of women, we need to take them out of poverty, we need to educate them. So how to break those cycles of poverty? And I would like to hear your insight on that. I know it's a huge issue, but it would be very insightful for us to know how you see the world from your experience in life.
Well, I think
Thank you.
certainly the portal for lifting people up, lifting women up, is economic empowerment. And there are growing numbers of initiatives, programs, policies being introduced today from microcredit and that lowest level of ability to earn an income and move up into small business, because small and medium-sized businesses also are what grows economies. That's where the force is in terms of GDP growth. And women are disadvantaged, yet a vital force to make that happen. And so there's a lot of work today going into those areas that are obstacles. Access to training, skills building, credit, a huge one. A lot of innovative work in Latin America through the Inter-American Development Bank, and to markets. Companies buying from local entrepreneurs instead of female entrepreneurs, instead of sourcing from longer, farther distances. But among the most interesting things to me that are happening, and certainly this is true in places in Latin America, are the conditional cash transfers. So governments are providing resources to predominantly the women in a household, the mothers, with the proviso that that money go to the education and well-being of their children. And companies are doing very interesting work today in ensuring through technology, like a card, like a credit card, but through technology, the government transfers the money into the card. It is safer than if you're carrying cash around. Bribes become diminished, corruption becomes diminished, and you take that card and pay for the things that are those allowable expenses under this conditional cash transfer. That is having a tremendous impact on raising up both the progress for the children, but also the ability of women to make their way in ways that can support their families and their communities more significantly.
Milan, can you tell us a little bit about what your organization at Georgetown University is doing?
The Institute for Women, Peace, and Security at Georgetown was started about 3 years ago. It was about the time I left the State Department. And it's a recognition that women have a critical role to play in peace building and in the security sector more largely. So many countries today, including the United States, have national action plans on women, peace, and security. And it's a recognition that in our work as diplomatic work, in our development work, and in our military operations, we should factor in the perspectives of women and their participation for the kinds of outcomes we want to see. And today that extends to countering violent extremism, where you've got women both as perpetrators of violent extremism becoming radicalized, or you've got violent extremist groups just focused on women in terms of the kinds of horrors they are perpetrating against them, whether it's Boko Haram or ISIS. But women are part of that solution in their communities in retarding some of that and informing on some of that. So it's a large area. Much of the world is in conflict. The nature of conflict has changed today, far more civil wars, and it's governments up against insurgencies within countries. And then the peace processes are such that the real factors that should be considered never make it to the peace table. So usually amnesty is given to the warriors for what they perpetrated against the women, and decisions are made in a way that never really moves down to the country at large. And consequently, most of the conflicts are recurring conflicts, and the real problems that should have been addressed are not addressed. And that is an element we know from what has happened in places from Northern Ireland to Rwanda, to Colombia now with their process, to the Philippines with the insurgency in Mindanao, where women are making an extraordinary difference in the issues that they're bringing to the table. Human rights, victims' rights, economic issues, the kinds of issues that they know from their experience on the ground have to make it to those discussions or nothing changes. And so what we're doing is we're involved in a lot of the research, making the case, demonstrating why this isn't a luxury, it's not an option, it's a necessity in terms of peace building and the outgrowths of the peace building process, as well as bringing leaders together in ways that they recognize how this impacts the kinds of outcomes they want to see, and obviously working with students and imbuing them with the kind of resources that they need as they go into their careers. But this is an area that has largely been devoid of women's participation. Some 4% of peace negotiators have been women. Within 5 years, at least half of peace agreements are abrogated and never fulfill the intent. We've got to find a better way to do this business. And you can't do it if the people who are both impacted and know a great deal about what's going on in their societies are not part of the solution. And because data and research and evidence speaks more loudly to decision makers than the narratives of women's lives and what's happening, we're investing a lot into that research component.
We are out of time, so join me in thanking Milan Verveer for this incredible talk. Thank you. We're going to pause for just a few minutes so lunch can be served, and then we're going to hear from Amy Raskin and Claudine Isaacs. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I opened that for you because I thought you might be thirsty.
We're going to continue. Please continue to enjoy your lunch, but we're going to move on with our program since we're relatively short on time today. As Stacy mentioned, my name's Amy Raskin. I'm the Chief Investment Officer at Chevy Chase Trust, and I'm honored to introduce Dr. Claudine Isaacs. Dr. Isaacs is a board-certified physician in medical oncology and a tenured professor of medicine and oncology at Georgetown University. She is the co-director of the Breast Cancer Research Program and the director of the Clinical Breast Cancer Program at the Lombardi Comprehensive Cancer Center at Georgetown. She is also the medical director of the Jess and Mildred Fisher Center for Hereditary Cancer and Clinical Genomics Research at Georgetown University. Dr. Isaacs has extensive experience in conducting clinical trials that focus on all aspects of breast cancer. Additional research interests include cancer risk assessment and medical management and prevention strategies for women at high risk for breast cancer. She has authored over 170 peer-reviewed publications, numerous book chapters, and served as editor for a seminal textbook on hereditary breast cancer. She has also served on a number of committees, including the Cancer Education Committee at ASCO, the ASCO Scientific Program Committee, and she's a member of the Breast Oncology Local Diseases Task Force of the Breast Cancer Steering Committee of the NCI. She's been named one of America's top cancer doctors by Castle Connolly Newsweek for many years running and has received designations from Washington Magazine and Women's Health Magazine. A native of Canada, Dr. Isaacs has earned her medical degree and completed residency training at McGill University. So with no further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Claudine Isaacs.
So thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm on? You can hear me okay? Okay. So thanks for that very kind introduction. What I'd like to do in the next 10 to 15 minutes or so is review with you some of the more recent advances in the treatment of women with breast cancer, as well as those who are at increased risk for developing this disease. At the end, what I'd like to focus on is some of where I think we might be going over the next 5 years or so when we think about the treatment of women with breast cancer. So I was asked before I start to give you a little bit of background about myself and how I got here. And you heard already, and you probably would have figured it out pretty quickly, that I'm Canadian. I was born and raised in Montreal, and I did most of my education and training there. I was not one of these people who, as a 6-year-old, knew I wanted to be a doctor. I actually knew I was interested in science, and I really thought that what I would do with my life is go on to get a graduate degree, get a PhD, and work in a basic science research lab. And that's how I approached my undergraduate education. As a parenthesis, it's a lot more fun to be an undergrad who's thinking about science than pre-med. So I really enjoyed my undergrad a lot more than my pre-med colleagues. But partway along the road, I got some advice that maybe doing medicine would be a smarter way to do this. If I really wanted to do something that could have an impact in the lab, maybe I should learn more about the disease itself and learn through my medical education, and then come back to a lab and be a basic scientist who had the education and the understanding of what it meant in the clinic, in the practical space. So that's how I went to medical school. I went to medical school thinking that that's what I would do with my medical education. And that premise held true for me for the first year or so, until the second year of medical school, when I ended up for the very first time in clinic. And that changed everything for me. For me, once I had my first patient care experience, that's where I knew I wanted to be. I wanted to be able to take some of what I understood about science, but translate it and offer it to the person who was in front of me, and to hopefully help guide somebody through a difficult diagnosis. And as I made my way through my medical residency and eventually to oncology, there was no better place than that for me to take what I understood and what I was continuing to learn about the treatment and understanding of this disease, but hopefully bring it down to a personal level and recognize, as doctors, what we know and what we recognize is we're not treating an illness, right? We're treating a person. And we're treating that person who is surrounded by family and loved ones. And that it's very important, obviously, to recommend appropriate treatment, but to do it in the context of treating the whole person. So I was fortunate after my residency and my training in Montreal to be offered a year of breast cancer fellowship at Georgetown's Lombardi. And then I was very fortunate after that year to be offered a faculty position. And I I've been there ever since for more years than I would like to admit. I have been in this city, and I've been at Georgetown. And I think some of you in the audience know about Lombardi, you have connections to it, but let me just take a minute or two to tell you a little bit about Lombardi and what it is. Lombardi is one of the 47 NCI-designated comprehensive cancer centers, and what does that mean? That means that I have the luxury of working in an environment that has tremendous depth and breadth. I work not only with a lot of other clinicians who are really focused solely on the care of breast cancer patients, and when I say lots of other clinicians, what do I mean? People like me, medical oncologists, but surgeons and radiation oncologists and plastic surgeons and breast imagers and pathologists and lots of other behind-the-scenes people who are really involved in the care, solely in the care of breast cancer patients or women at risk for this disease. And at Lombardi, in order to be a comprehensive cancer center, you not only have to have the clinical expertise that has as a strong focus research, you also have to have a lot of interdisciplinary work with basic scientists who are trying to help us figure out the underpinnings of the disease and how we could really shift the outcome for women by better understanding what's going on, and also behavioral or population scientists who help us translate that into the community. So that's some of where I am and where I have been. So what I'd like to do now is try to talk to you about some of the advances in breast cancer over the 20 plus years that I've had the opportunity to be in this field. And it actually was quite a daunting task. When I finally sat down to really think about what I was going to say today, I became quickly overwhelmed. And what I realized is that there have been so many advances in breast cancer, and we have made so much progress since when I first started, that I couldn't possibly spend the time telling you everything about where we have gotten and what we have done to get to where we are today. So the overarching principle on this is that for a woman who's diagnosed with breast cancer today in this country, her outlook is so much better than it used to be, even 10 years ago or 15 years ago or 20 years ago. And that's really because of advances that we've made in understanding the treatment of this disease predominantly, as well as advances in screening for this disease. So what I thought I would do is give you some examples from different areas. I've already alluded to the fact that I work within a small village, right? A community of clinicians who are involved in the care of cancer patients. So I thought I'd give you little examples from different of those areas to give you a sense of things. So if we think about breast cancer, and just to give you just some general overview of this, we really think about breast cancer as early stage disease, where we're really trying to increase the chance of cure for the disease that's confined to the breast or the lymph nodes on the same side. And then there's metastatic disease or advanced disease. And in the early stage setting, I think many of you have heard about the surgical treatment of early stage breast cancer, which is typically something like lumpectomy or mastectomy. And what has happened over the years has really been a reduction in the type of surgery that gets done, so as we're minimizing the toxicities of the surgery. So when I started, women with early stage breast cancer all had virtually all of the lymph nodes underneath their arm removed at the time of diagnosis. And that led to risks of arm swelling that have obvious consequences. And what has happened through a series of well-done clinical trials, what has become apparent is that you don't have to take out all the lymph nodes. You just have to identify the first node or the first set of nodes that would be the initial ones that would drain. If there was a cancer, they'd be the initial ones that the cancer would go to. And that's called a sentinel node procedure. So it's sort of like the sentinel soldier, the scout soldier that you send out to look. If you identify that and that's negative, you're done. And what you can do is you can minimize the toxicity and the risks associated with taking out all of the lymph nodes. Similarly, my plastic surgery colleagues, cosmesis is just, advances at warp speed. What they can do in terms of reconstructive surgery these days for women who have mastectomies is just drastically different from what they were able to do even a few years ago. So the cosmetic outcome for somebody who has a mastectomy and who has reconstruction for breast cancer is so much better because of the advances in the techniques. My radiation oncology colleagues are getting better and better at minimizing other areas of exposure, so they're really narrowing down their field of radiation, and they're being able to plan in a more focused way, and thereby also diminish the risks from the radiation. In terms of what I do as a medical oncologist, I'm the one who makes recommendations for systemic treatment to reduce the risk of the cancer coming back, and that's where chemotherapy comes in, or endocrine therapy or targeted therapy. And really, again, in this field, we've seen these incredible advances over the past number of years. And if I thought of how I could distill that down for you, what we're really getting to in medicine, and this is true for breast cancer, but honestly it's true for most areas in cancer or in medicine in general, what we're trying to do is get more personalized, more tailored, more individualized in our treatment recommendations. So what we're trying to do really most basically is find the right drug for the right person. The converse of that is not exposing people who don't need it to those drugs as well. So the advances that have been made have really been along two parallel paths: new drugs being developed and identification of new targets that we could potentially, so that the drug developers could develop drugs that target those specific areas. And I'll give you a couple of examples here. So there's a subtype of breast cancer. When I first started, it was the most aggressive subtype. It was a subtype known as HER2-positive breast cancer. So breast cancer gets divided into different subtypes, and some of you might have friends or might have gone through it or might know somebody, so this lingo might be familiar. But this HER2-positive breast cancer, what is it? What is HER2? HER2 is a protein. It's present in excess amounts in about 15 to 20% of breast cancers. What is it? It's a receptor. So it's sort of like something sitting on the surface of the cell. You can think of it like a television antenna, waiting for something to bind to it, to turn it on. You don't want cancer cells turned on, right? You want them turned off, okay? So it became apparent when HER2 was identified as a very important driver for that subtype of breast cancer. What became apparent is it would be really great to figure out something to turn that off. So when I first started, we didn't have that something. And subsequently what happened is that drugs were developed that targeted HER2 and were able to turn it off. And what large randomized clinical trials showed was that women who got that drug, and that drug's called Herceptin, it's been around now for a decade and a half or 2 decades, that drug, when you added it to standard chemotherapy, markedly changed the outcome for women who had that subtype of breast cancer. More recently, another drug, another antibody that targets a different part of HER2 has been identified, has been tested in clinical trials that we and others have participated in, has been shown to add over and above what Herceptin did. And so now the outlook for women with HER2-positive breast cancer is actually excellent. And I just had a patient who was really not sure that she wanted treatment, and I had to remind her that in the absence of the incredible therapies that we have available, the risk of recurrence is enormously high, but that is dramatically different when you have these therapies at hand. The other area that we can think of when we're thinking about that is how can we minimize treatment? How can we avoid treatment in people who don't need it? So there have been a series of assays or tests that have been developed that allow us to figure out which women in a certain subset of breast cancer can avoid chemotherapy entirely. So turn the clock back again, 10 plus years, we used to give chemotherapy to huge swaths of women when we knew that we were only benefiting a few, but we weren't smart enough to be able to figure out who those few were. And this assay that got developed and validated and had to be proven to us that it was actually useful and we could trust it, now changes things dramatically. We send this off on the tumor specimen of all people who have that subtype of breast cancer to try and figure out whether that woman is a woman who actually will be the one who would benefit from chemotherapy based on the characteristics of her tumor, as compared to the one who could avoid it. And so those things have allowed us to get more tailored and more personalized in our approaches. The final area that I just want to highlight as we think about this has to do with the genetics of breast cancer. I think many of you have heard a lot about this, right? We've all heard Angelina Jolie's story, right? And Angelina Jolie her mom had ovarian cancer, and she was found to carry a BRCA1 mutation. And what we know is that individuals who have a BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutation have a markedly elevated risk of developing both early onset breast cancer and early onset ovarian cancer. So it was about 2 decades ago that those genes were identified, and it became possible to offer genetic testing to women who came from these high-risk families. At the time, we started our genetics program at Georgetown Lombardi, and we really helped and were part of an international effort that helped to characterize what it meant to have a BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutation. So at the beginning, what it felt like was that you just had a crystal ball, right? And you just sat in front of somebody and said, look, I'm really sorry. You have a mutation in BRCA1, so you have a really high risk of developing breast or ovarian cancer. There are things that we think we can do to help mitigate those risks, but we don't have evidence. And in medicine, you really have to have concrete evidence before you're making recommendations, if at all possible. Sometimes we make it in the absence of evidence, but it's obviously a lot stronger if we can have evidence to support that. So we used to say that to these women. And what's happened is an explosion of information because of collaborations like the one that I mentioned to you that allow us to now tell these women that we can do things that are highly impactful. So Angelina Jolie very bravely wrote about what she went through, right, and what she did. And she went through surgeries to reduce her risk. And obviously what we're hoping is that women down the line won't need to go through surgeries and will have found something better to do to minimize risks and force them to go through rather aggressive surgeries to impact that. But what has also happened is that there has been an explosion of information in that field. So technology has kept pace. Medical knowledge caught up with BRCA1 and BRCA2, and all the while technology was going on the side. And initially what happened is that our genes were considered the property of one company. The Supreme Court said that's not okay, mercifully in 2013, so opened the door for competition for lots of companies to come in and offer genetic testing for hereditary breast and ovarian cancer. And at the same time, technology was evolving. So in the 1990s when I started, you could test for BRCA1, BRCA2. It took about 3 months to get the test result back. It cost several $1,000s. Where are we in 2017? Companies can now test for 10s, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 genes at a time, and you can get the test results back somewhere between about 2 weeks from now, or 2 weeks from the time you send it, to a couple of months to get that complete information. And what has happened is we've recognized there are other genes beyond BRCA1 and BRCA2, so that's what's being tested for. The asterisk on that is that our medical knowledge has not quite caught up with all of those genes. Okay? So while technology can test for these, we don't have data yet on the implications for all of these genes, either in terms of their cancer risks or in terms of what we can make recommendations for in terms of management for these women or these individuals. There are some that we definitely know about, but some that we don't. So I tend to tell people that technology for the time being has outpaced our medical knowledge. I'm quite confident that our medical knowledge will catch up, but I also tend to encourage women, if they're going to think about genetic testing, that they do that within the context of a program that has expertise in that and that can help them figure out what the best test is for them and to help them interpret those test results. So as I said, I was going to end by focusing a little bit on where I think we're going. And I think we're going in medicine increasingly towards this era of personalized or individualized or tailored treatment. And again, I think we're coming at that from a number of different ways. We have technologies that are available. We're frequently sending off individuals' tumors to look at what is expressed within the tumor itself. So the genes that are expressed, the ones that are silent, the proteins that are elevated and the ones that aren't, that hopefully help us identify things that could be targeted, that could be potentially the Achilles heel of that tumor. Sort of the analogy, the HER2 situation that I told you about, these drugs Herceptin and pertuzumab are drugs that hit the Achilles heel of HER2-positive breast cancer. What we're trying to find is the Achilles heel not only of that subtype of breast cancer, cancers in general, but also we recognize that cancers are heterogeneous. So not every HER2-positive breast cancer is the same. There are differences between individuals. So we want to help do that. And I think technology is allowing us to interrogate those tumors, and we're also able to do it sometimes on blood specimens. So increasingly we're trying to look at the importance that we can gain by looking at maybe tumor DNA that is shed into the bloodstream, so people don't have to go through biopsies for us to get that. In conjunction and in parallel, there's tremendous advances in drug development. Okay? So we're seeing companies and basic scientists who are identifying drugs that could target these new things that are being identified. And so I think all of that is going to lead us to a much more personalized place. And then the final piece of this is really, how do we share this information? And I think increasingly what we're seeing is thinking about alternative methods, about web-based and other interventions to help educate patients, their families, others, on the implications and how to interpret and deal with these results, hopefully leading to either personal behaviors or lifestyle behaviors that would reduce cancer risk or reduce disease risk in general, as well as improve outcomes to therapy. So I'm going to stop here. I'd be happy to answer any questions, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And for those of you that don't know, this is a topic near and dear to my heart because we've been investing in a lot of public companies that are it hopefully facilitating some of these new technologies and diagnostic. Oh, hello? All right. Hold on. Okay. Is that better? Yes. Okay. Sorry. Okay. I apologize. I was just saying, and for those of you who have been at some of our past conferences, we've had speakers from some of the public companies that we're investing in that hopefully are facilitating some of these new technologies and diagnostics in the cancer space. And this is a topic near and dear to my heart for many reasons. But can you talk a little bit more about the drugs that are coming to market and the clinical trials that are ongoing and how it works if you have a patient that you find has a type of genetic disease and how you match them to a clinical trial. And we know the oncology drug market is booming. It's supposed to surpass $100 billion last year for the first time and is growing very rapidly. But these drugs, and there's a lot of controversy around the pricing of these drugs as well, but they are saving lives and changing outcomes. So can you just talk about sort of how you're matching patients with appropriate drugs?
Yeah. A complex question, so let me try and address some of that. So one of the things that we are recognizing, whereas before we used to silo cancers into their primary site of disease, so we wouldn't think about treating a breast cancer like a colon cancer, like a lung cancer, like something else, although obviously that's not entirely true because some of our chemotherapy works in all these different cancers. But when we thought about targeting specific things in the tumor, we used to view it in that way. And I think increasingly what we're recognizing is that there are common mechanisms in different cancers, and they can be targeted by specific drugs that would target different parts of pathways. Typically, these pathways are pathways that are important for survival of the cancer cell that leads to its growth and its ability to spread somewhere it shouldn't, to set up home and to grow, which is not what we want to have happen. And so there is a lot of interest in developing drugs that hit very specific targets. And before, what we also saw is that companies weren't necessarily that interested. If only 1% of breast cancers had this target, who was going to invest to develop a drug that would only impact 1% of breast cancer? But when you can identify that target because people are doing profiling of the tumor to find that target, and it could cross different disease types, then there is much more logic in developing something like that. So there are, in fact, a number of studies that are open to all sorts of different types of cancer, because typically when clinical trials were developed or are developed, they're typically focused on a specific disease. But now they're more sort of agnostic to the disease type. And what they do is they say, if there is a mutation or an alteration or this gene is expressed or whatever it is, this person is a candidate for participation in that trial. And so those trials are written in a much broader way. And often what is also happening is as new drugs are being developed, typically there are a series of phases that a drug goes through when it's going through clinical trials before it could get to the point of being FDA approved. And so typically you have a trial where you're looking at checking out toxicity of the drug, checking out what's the right dose, what's the toxicity, what's tolerable, what makes sense. And then once you'd establish that, you then say, okay, does it make sense to treat people with breast cancer or prostate cancer with this? And what's increasingly happening is within those trials, you're getting to the point where you figure out what the safe dose is, and then the trial is sort of expanding outward to be open for small segments, different disease types, to get a signal. Does it work in this subtype of cancer that has that particular pathway activated or whatever is going on?
That's great. Yeah, and a lot of your patients are participating in these trials?
Yeah, so we have, as a comprehensive cancer center, one of the advantages of working there and being there is that one has access to these trials. So we have, I can't quote you the number, but we have a lot of trials open with new drugs, both looking at new drugs in development, and then we also have, once there's a clear signal in a particular cancer in a particular subtype, then you get a more definitive trial, a later phase trial initiated. So we have those trials available. But what we also understand is that, you're going to get early signals of what might work, but what you get then, you might be able to inform back by going back to the lab. This concept of translational research is that research comes from the lab to the clinic, but then what you see in clinic can come back and translate back to the lab so that we can better understand what's going on there. And so we have a lot of trials open that are trying to translate both from the lab to the clinic, but then take us back to the lab, because what we need to understand, again, getting back to this premise of tailored or personalized medicine, is we need to understand which groups of individuals would be likeliest to respond to it, and what is it about that person. It might not just be what you can find on the tumor, right? The tumor exists within a person, and within a person there's their immune responsiveness, how they metabolize drugs, all sorts of other things that could impact. So it's really important for that research to be able to cycle in that way.
What are some of the most common misperceptions about breast cancer? When a patient first walks in, or you first meet a patient, what are some of their fears that might be unfounded, and some things that they might not be thinking about that you think that they should know?
I think the really important thing for a breast cancer patient to know is that her outcome is likely terrific. You know, we have really changed where things are, and people are nobody wants to meet me, right? Nobody wants to meet a medical oncologist. That's sort of not high on your list. Hopefully you wouldn't hate meeting me in a social circumstance, but you wouldn't want to meet me at work. So I think that it's really important to understand that most people will survive breast cancer. And I tend to tell them that, yes, for the time being, some of the treatments that we recommend, have side effects. And obviously one of the other important things to tell people is that we also, in parallel, the whole market of how we help to manage those side effects has really changed dramatically. So I tell our fellows that they have no idea what the real side effects of chemotherapy are, because they've been brought up in an era where we have fantastic drugs that can help mitigate the side effects of the treatment that we give. And so I remind them, because don't ever forget to order that drug. When you're ordering a chemotherapy, make sure to give this other drug, because it's our job to make this journey as easy as possible. And if they haven't had that exposure. But I do tend to tell patients that this will fade in their rearview mirror, that most women will survive this disease and survive well, and that's what we're here as to help them through that.
In many ways, it feels like breast cancer, the survival rates and the research around breast cancer and the drugs for breast cancer is ahead of some of the other cancers. Can you speak to that at all? Do you agree with that statement?
I do agree, and I think part of what's gone on with breast cancer is we were earlier to the table to figure out some of the targets with breast cancer. So breast cancer has not been a one-size-fits-all for a long time. It's not yet down to the granularity of a person, and that's where we're trying to get, okay? But we're not yet there. But for now 3 decades, we've been dividing breast cancer into different subtypes and treating it differently, and we had drugs that targeted specific pathways that were important for the survival of that cancer cell. So we had effective therapies, and because of that, I think we were ahead of the game. We're a little bit behind the game in one area that I didn't talk about that's obviously a huge area in oncology, and that's immunotherapy, which has really exploded, right, in the last few years. And the concept behind immunotherapy is just, if we think of what our immune system is supposed to do, it's supposed to recognize things that are not us, right? So you get a bacterial infection, your immune cells are supposed to hone in on that and get rid of that. And cancer is not self, but for some reason, cancer has been able to go below the radar, right? And the reason that we're starting to figure out about why it was able to go below the radar of the immune system and evade the immune system was because cancer cells were smart, and they figured out how to produce substances that dampen down the immune system, that put the brakes on the immune system. And so drugs have been developed now to take the brakes off, and even in some places to give a little gas to the immune system. So the immune system could do its job. It could go around and hone in to the cancer cells and get rid of them. And so there are some cancers more recently that were traditionally very resistant to our standard therapies, where now it has dramatically changed. So melanoma and some lung cancers and various other cancers are very, very responsive to immunotherapy. Breast cancer doesn't produce quite as much of an immune response. And so there's a lot of work going on, although there are some subtypes where we're starting to see some signals of efficacy. But there's a lot of work going on to try and figure out in breast cancer how we wake back up the immune system to help be vigilant against cancer cells.
How important is time between diagnosis and treatment? And We've been told forever you have to be screened every year, get a mammogram, because early detection is one of the answers. Is that still true?
Most things in medicine have a complicated answer. Basically, yes. Okay. But it's more nuanced. And I haven't gotten out the Canadian in me despite being here for 25 years. So, it was drilled into me to be very evidence-based in how I approach medicine. So I think the current recommendation is to really individualize the recommendation for when to start screening mammography, and that it be started somewhere around the age of 40 to 45, and then once you get to the age of 50, either do it annually or once every 2 years. And we have good evidence that doing it that way reduces the risk of succumbing to breast cancer, because what you're doing with screening is diagnosing a cancer at its earlier stage when it's most likely to be curable. But what will probably end up being the case over time is that we're a broad population, right? We're very heterogeneous, and there are some people who are at really high risk, but there are also some people who are at remarkably low risk. And what we're trying to do is identify those people. That's another area within personalization that we're trying to get at, to figure out who's at really low risk and doesn't need that screening, because she'll get that screening for no good reason. She'll have unnecessary biopsies or procedures that she didn't need to have. But conversely, the person who's at higher risk, we definitely should do that.
And maybe start earlier.
Absolutely, or do other modalities. Breast MRI is being looked at and is part of the screening recommendation for mutation carriers, for instance. So there are other modalities that will come into this.
And we tend to think of cancer as a genetic disease, but there are outside and environmental factors that also play a role. Can you just discuss that, and who is most at risk and who's least at risk?
So the people who are at the highest risk that we can identify for developing breast cancer are people who have a genetic predisposition to it. So the Angelina Jolies of the world are the ones who are at the highest risk, people who have a mutation or alteration in a single gene that results in that gene being non-functional. And those women have this very high risk of developing breast and ovarian cancer. But about 20 to 30% of women with breast cancer will have some sort of family history of that disease, and so they probably have inherited other genes, not BRCA1 or BRCA2, but genes that we call lower penetrance genes. They have a lower risk they confer a lower risk of developing breast cancer, but it's possible they act in a fashion together and with various environmental exposures to increase risk. And then there's a broad group of women where we don't have that many risk factors. There are some reproductive history risk factors that are out there, but it's not like the link between smoking and lung cancer.
Right.
We don't have that in breast cancer.
Right.
And we've also done a lot of work as a medical community and as a scientific community to try and figure out environmental exposures, and we haven't really found anything. So there's some things that are practical. The good news is, eat healthy is good for everything.
Right.
Exercise, it's good for everything, okay? So there's some basic truths that we should all take and we should all do, but we don't have the stop smoking and you won't get lung cancer when we're talking about breast cancer.
I have some more questions, but I will open it up to the audience to ask. I think Mark and Craig are still around, and if we have time, I'll come back.
Hi, I'm Sammy.
Hi.
Where are we currently with advancements in prevention of late recurrence metastatic disease?
So prevention of occurrence of metastatic disease, or women who, okay. So, the question is, where are we at trying to figure out how we prevent a late recurrence? So something about early stage breast cancer is now years out, and how we prevent something from happening down the line. And, that's been one of the perplexing things in breast cancer. There are women who have early stage disease, have treatment, everything looks good, and yet years later, rarely, please let me make it clear to everyone that it's not at all common that this happens, but rarely, 10, 15 years later, that cancer rears its head and has spread somewhere else. And that suggests that there was something about that cancer cell that allowed it to lay dormant and inapparent for a period of time, and then become apparent again. And there is, in fact, a lot of work going on that, a lot of work that's trying to figure out, is it like a cancer stem cell that's out there? There are studies that are trying to look in women who have another subtype of breast cancer that I didn't speak about yet, but hormone receptor positive breast cancer, where we're giving oral therapy for 5 years, and these years we're saying 10 years and maybe 15 years. I just had to put together a talk for a symposium I did last weekend looking at that whole issue of, who needs treatment for 10 years or 15 years? And again, that's where I see the future taking us in that, because there is a small subset of women who do benefit from extended or prolonged treatment because they are at risk for that late recurrence. And there are a lot of companies that are appropriately trying to help us figure out who those few women are so we can treat them and we can leave everyone else alone. So there is a lot of work being done on that, and we're about to open up a study that's actually looking at that concept of tumor dormancy and how you turn off, how you get to those dormant tumor cells and get rid of them so we don't have to worry about them anymore.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Isaac. My name is Marjorie O'Connell. I'm interested in the subject of immunology on which you touched, and I'm particularly interested in some of the popular literature I've read about taking someone's tumor and developing some sort of immune care for them that's stored for when the cancer may reoccur. Could you explain to us that whole science and which gynecological cancers it may be effective with?
Maybe.
Maybe.
There are a lot of different ways of thinking about how immunotherapy might act, and there are a lot of different avenues that are being looked at. So some of the avenues are just some antibodies or other drugs that have been developed that directly target the immune system in a person to try and, take off the hidden cloak and put the gas on the immune cells and getting the cells to rev up and to recognize the cancer. The other thing that's been looked at is what I think you're referring to as this CAR T cell type of treatment, where actually what happens is you take a piece of the tumor, you expose outside of the person, you expose immune cells, T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes to that tumor. You create cells that are particularly geared to attack the characteristics of proteins that are expressed in the tumor, and then you reinfuse that into the patient, so those cells can then go out sort of like some sort of attack dog of some sort and sniff out those cells and get them. And so that is being looked at in some hematologic malignancies. It actually hasn't made its way to breast cancer, which is honestly all I have done for 25 years, so you don't want me to pretend to be a more general oncologist than I am. But it is being looked at certainly in hematologic malignancies and in other malignancies more in the setting of clinical trials.
My name's Laurel Glassman. I wanted to ask, is money the biggest impediment to breast cancer research?
So money is an impediment to research funds. You have all heard, I'm sure, that federal funding is incredibly tight. So less than 5 to 10% of really well thought out research projects will actually get funded by peer-reviewed funding these days. And one of the things that really makes a huge difference is what most institutions are able to raise in terms of philanthropy to let good ideas get tested, have their tires kicked a bit, get some preliminary data, so that then you can take those good ideas, develop enough evidence that then you can go to a more definitive peer-reviewed funding. So money certainly does make a huge difference to the advances that we can make, because a lot of these technologies and a lot of what we're doing both in the basic science lab or running a clinical trial are enormously expensive and really need the funding to be able to carry them out.
Do you have a...
Hello, Dr. Isaacs. My name is Debbie Barr, and you talked about prevention or identifying metastatic breast cancer. What's being done in terms of effective trials once you have it?
For the treatment of metastatic breast cancer. So again, we have made huge advances in the treatment of metastatic breast cancer. So there are new drugs that have recently been FDA approved based on clinical trials. looking at improving the outcome of women with the hormone receptor positive subtype of breast cancer. So there are a couple of drugs that have gotten FDA approval or conditional accelerated approval in the last year or two that have dramatically changed the landscape. And there are a lot of trials behind that that are looking at other ways. And scientists at our institution and others are really working hard to figure out how cancer cells develop resistance to therapies so that we can figure out how to help overcome that resistance. So that class of drugs that was just approved is helping to overcome or increase responsiveness to standard hormonal therapies. There are also trials being carried out in all different subtypes of breast cancer. So we're starting to get some good signals about things that we might be able to use in a subset of breast cancer that's known as triple-negative breast cancer. So using some novel therapies that are also trying to find that concept, that the Achilles heel of those types of cancers, to try and improve the response and the duration of response in those people. And in the HER2 positive space, I talked to you about 2 drugs that have just gotten approval, or some longer ago, but some more recently. But there are a host of other drugs that are making their way up. So for everything that you're seeing that's available now, there are probably 10 to 100 times more drugs that are being tried, that are being evaluated within the setting of clinical trials to help improve that. And then in breast cancer, we're also looking at immunotherapy in breast cancer. So all of that is being investigated within the setting of clinical trial.
Are postmenopausal estrogens still an anathema?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Are postmenopausal estrogens still a no-no?
Are postmenopausal estrogens still a no-no? Okay, I understood. Again, a nuanced answer to that one. So if women take postmenopausal estrogen only close to or right at the time of going through menopause, there is actually some suggestion, certainly there's suggestion that it is not particularly harmful, and there are actually some data that suggests it might be helpful for breast cancer. Taking combination estrogen and progesterone, though, does result in a modest but real increased risk for developing breast cancer.
I have one, Craig.
Hi, my name is Abby Marshall. I'm wondering what advice you have for women who went through the traditional treatment 15 years ago. Is there any new things coming up that they should be aware of in terms of revisiting the kind of medical care they're getting now?
That's a great question. So the question was really advice for people who went through treatment years ago and are doing well. I think that the main area that I harp on our fellows about is to think about why that person developed cancer. Is there any possibility of any genetic risk? Because there are women who had genetic testing in 2001 and were told that they tested negative. Well, technology has really changed, our knowledge has really changed, and it might be that she might want to think about revisiting and having a discussion about genetic testing on a broader basis based on family history. So there's that point. And then the other issue is really more for just a subset of women who have hormone receptor positive breast cancer. The big controversy, and one of the discussions that we're having all the time in clinic these days, is how long do you keep the hormonal therapy on for, and what should you do in terms of that? So those are the 2 big areas for women who have like a remote history of early stage breast cancer and are doing great. And then I think that we have far more evidence today about some lifestyle interventions, not hard ones, okay? So again, going back to like don't eat at McDonald's very often, okay? And eat your fruits and vegetables. And physical activity, we now have good evidence about the impact of physical activity in breast cancer survivors and maintaining healthy body weight. So just, touching base again with your medical oncologist is probably a good idea, just to see whether there's anything new that's happened.
Is your expectation that, or maybe this is happening now, that most cancer patients are going to have different treatments, and we're talking about personalized medicine, or is it still just big groups there are sort of blocks of cancer?
I will tell you that I'm very happy that I recertified for my boards a couple of years ago, because there is no way in the world that I could possibly reteach my old brain about diseases that I don't treat. But I look at my colleagues and I have no idea what I would tell a friend or family member about the treatment of lung cancer anymore, because there are 5 different subtypes of lung cancer. So and the information is just galloping along.
Right.
So I think there is very little that is monolithic like it used to be. We don't recommend treatment, say, oh, you have lung cancer, you should get X. It's now, okay, let's figure out more what's going on. What's the subtype of lung cancer that's occurring? What should we be recommending based on that? So yeah, I think we're at this, we're moving at this warp speed in medicine, where we're able to identify targets. There are drugs that are being developed for those targets, and we're doing clinical trials. And the other thing that I've noticed, actually, interestingly, is over the years, I think there's a much greater acceptance from individuals to participate in clinical trials, because there's this knowledge of what clinical trials has brought us. Really, in medicine, you can't just say, oh, this drug looks like a great idea, look, it's safe, let's just use it. We have to actually prove that it makes a difference. We have to understand what the side effects are. We have to understand what is the magnitude of the difference that it makes, so we can weigh the risk and benefit of the treatment for the patient. So I think that what we're seeing is an explosion of information because of all of that, and I really do think that the days of just treating people in a single fashion are gone.
And
which is great.
And in breast cancer, how many different subtypes of breast cancer do you regularly see now? I mean, is it 5, 10, 15?
Right now, we break it up into 4 or 5, but we recognize that within those categories, there are subcategories. Right. So the example to give, and I think of that when I see a patient who has a subtype of breast cancer that is negative for all of the markers that we currently have proven targets for this triple negative subtype of breast cancer, which is played on the media and on the web and everywhere as being an aggressive subtype of breast cancer. And some of it is an aggressive subtype of breast cancer, but not all of it. And we recognize that triple negative breast cancer probably has 6 or 7 different subtypes within it. And we just need to be able to figure out what they are. We need to prove that we should treat them differently, and we need to prove that they're different to be able to figure out how to better treat them.
And 5 years ago, would you have known that?
Not 5 years ago.
Okay.
You're testing my memory.
So I'm just, and 5 years from now, could you foresee those 6 or 7 becoming 20, or
And perhaps, as you were saying this, it's probably not 4 or 5 anymore, because I think that even within, I was giving you broad categories with profiling, with the assays that we're doing on subtypes of breast cancer, for instance, hormone receptor positive. We have a lot of tests that we can send off on those tumors to help us figure out the different subtypes of hormone receptor positive breast cancer as well. Right. So I think we're probably going to get to a point where it's not just, while we dearly love our pathologists and they're great and they're critically important to what we do, we're going to be sending off for additional testing on virtually every tumor to help us figure out how we should be more focused and individualized in our approach for that patient.
And I will just say, as these diagnostic companies are learning more, the tests are getting more expansive. So it used to be they were testing a couple hundred genes, and now they're testing 350 genes, and at one time more mutations.
And the other piece to think about is we think about testing the tumor, right? But the tumor exists within a person, and that person, what I imagine we'll also get to, is figuring out how to test within a person whether that person is likely to benefit or not from a drug because of how he or she handles or metabolizes that drug. So there are all sorts of other things, and the immune environment is actually separate from what you test in the tumor itself. So it's a very complex field, obviously.
And not to get political, but do you have any views on drug pricing? Especially breast cancer drug pricing? I mean, there's a lot of clinical trials are expensive, and drug discovery is obviously very expensive, so these drugs are coming to the market at eye-popping price tags, and it's...
I mean, the view that I have is that it's not sustainable, right? So I grew up in a country that had universal health care, and honestly, I strongly believe in universal health care. I believe that it's a right in a wealthy country. We should take care of ours, right? Having a devastating diagnosis of cancer, it's bad enough. We know how to treat it.
Right.
We should be able to offer that to everyone. But we can't offer it.
Sorry.
But we can't offer it at these prices, and clearly we have to, I won't get into political thoughts on this, but clearly we need a different view on life. But it's not going to be sustainable, okay? Perhaps as we get smarter and this concept of tailored medicine is not just giving more drugs to more people, it's avoiding some expensive drugs in probably huge subsets of people. So maybe as we get smarter, we'll be able to be more rational in how we spread this.
As you were saying, not everybody benefits from chemotherapy, but we didn't know who didn't benefit, so everybody got it.
And
now,
not everyone benefits from, the second antibody that's geared towards HER2-positive breast cancer. Right. Yeah, it makes a difference. But there were a big group of women who didn't need it, who did great without it. So we need to figure out who the delta is, right? Who needs it and who doesn't. And then we would be much more rational in how we do things.
Right. I'm sorry, I thought I saw one or two more questions. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Sharon, and I used to work on oncology many years ago. My question for you is, because the guidelines have changed so much over the years, is lumpectomy versus mastectomy? That's question number one. And then when you're talking about the woman and the person inside, if you're going to do mastectomy, why not go out and do both? Because no matter how skilled the plastic surgeon is, when you do one-sided mastectomy, you're going to end up like that. So I just was wondering your thoughts on that.
So I'll get pretty technical on you here. So the question is lumpectomy versus mastectomy to start with. And for most women who are diagnosed with early stage breast cancer, meaning breast cancer that's confined to the breast and the lymph nodes that are in the armpit on the same side, many of those women are candidates for what's called lumpectomy, meaning the surgeon takes out the tumor, takes a rim of normal tissue out around it, and then typically what's done is you get radiation after that to treat the area where the tumor was taken out and the rest of the at-risk breast, although there's a lot of discussion these days about can we narrow that down, but that's for another day. The data haven't changed, okay? The long-term outcome from well-done randomized trials that happened in this country and many other countries indicate for a woman who's a candidate for lumpectomy, for breast-conserving therapy versus mastectomy, her long-term outcome is identical, okay? And that hasn't changed. What has changed, unfortunately, and it's something that we really need to deal with and my behavioral science colleagues need to help me with, is how do we convey that message? Because we are seeing this huge uptick in mastectomy and in bilateral mastectomy. And for most women, their risk of developing breast cancer in the opposite breast is really, really small and doesn't medically warrant having a contralateral mastectomy on the other side, yet we're seeing this increase. And I think we all understand it. I mean, you get a cancer diagnosis, it's, oh my God, can I do everything I can to not have this come back, and I never want to face this again, okay? And it's a hard time to intervene and to try and help understand that does not actually change the outcome for the women. And yes, cosmetically in clothes, it might look better, and I told you that my plastic surgical colleagues are great, and they are, okay? I'm not diminishing what they do. And some of them will go so far as to say that what they do is better looking than what one had, okay? I personally don't believe that. But the other thing is that most reconstructed breasts don't feel anything, okay? And I think that's important for people to understand. While it can look good, it is not the same as having one's own breast tissue. Okay? And so for some women, again, this is I'm talking about personalizing things in terms of what's the right drug for the right person, but the other aspect of personalizing, which I always think of when I'm trying to figure out and help a woman make a decision about what she should be doing, is everyone has a different take, right? My take is not the same as your take or somebody else's take, and it's important for us to help guide people to what feels best for them, but in order for somebody to make an informed decision, they actually have to have the data so they can understand what they're deciding between. So yes, bilateral mastectomies would definitely prevent breast cancer, okay? But the likelihood for most women developing a new breast cancer, if they've already had one, is quite small. And there are other things that we can do to minimize that risk. But for some of those women, it's very appropriate for them to do bilateral mastectomy, but not for all of them. It's a personal choice, I think, for people. Sometimes, so that's a good question, and we did a study a number of years ago looking at that actually in mutation carriers. So sometimes people are not candidates for lumpectomy. They have a larger tumor, they have more than one tumor, so they're technical reasons, okay? And so if they're, technical or disease-related reasons why they would not be candidates for lumpectomy. Some women also don't want to do radiation because for the time being, lumpectomy goes with radiation. So that's again an area of personal choice for the patient to understand what her options are. So for most women with unilateral or one-sided breast cancer, their option is to have lumpectomy and radiation or mastectomy. And the answer to that is that's a personal choice for most women. It's not, the clinician's choice, it's not whoever's choice. It's what feels better for her or whatever feels like it's more comfortable or what she can face.
Any more questions?
No more questions.
Okay, well, I think I'm going to conclude then. Thank you so much for your time. It was so informative and so helpful. And I want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. We hope you enjoyed the discussion, and we look forward to seeing you at another Chevy Chase Trust event soon. Thank you. Great, thank you so much. That was great. Thank you. Thank you.
My back.